So, several days ago, one of my favorite YouTubers, his name is Matt from the Linux Cast, put out a video, and he puts out this type of video about once a year. And he does this because he sees this question asked on Reddit, Twitter, all those, famous places. Well, I guess it should be called X now. Thank you, Elon. Um, and the question is, what is the best distro? Or what distributions should I start with? The problem with asking that question is that, well, and the reason I'm making this video is because I want to take that question about Linux distros and I want to extend it beyond Linux distros and extend it to programming languages, databases, and especially IDEs. The reason that there is no answer to the question of what is the best distro programming language IDE is because it's all a very personal experience. So what you may or what I may be using, and I'll give you some examples of what I'm using. What I may be using may not be right in your specific situation. So when you ask that type of blanket type question like that, especially when you ask it on places like Reddit, you are going to get 1,001 answers. And the problem with it is something that someone might recommend to you. Let's say somebody says, okay, a Fedora is a really good Linux distribution. It's the one I use. So the person who asked the question goes out there and tries Fedora. And the problem is when they're using it, they find out that they don't really like it. The same thing happens with IDEs. I see this question asked all the time. Well, what IDE should I use for blah, blah, blah? C++, Python, Ruby, doesn't matter. You're going to get a whole bunch of people that are going to give you the answer of the one they use and happen to like. You may even see people say things like, "Oh, this is the best," and blah, 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 blah. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a YouTuber who was somewhat fresh out of college by the look of it. I know he was fairly young, a lot younger than me. And when he was beginning his series, I believe the series was on Python development, but he was talking about how to get started and what to use, what to download. And the guy says in the video, "Wow, um, just use Visual Studio Code. You don't need to look at anything else." And the first question that popped out of my mind was, okay, well, what if you don't like Visual Studio Code? So if you're new into programming and you think that this guy is an expert and he's sitting there telling you to use Visual Studio Code, you try it, you don't like it, well, then what do you do? The correct answer to that is not just blindly tell somebody to use Visual Studio Code. The correct answer is to tell that person or to recommend to that person that they need to try different IDEs. It's the same answer I give to people who are looking for Linux distributions. I don't know you. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what your workflow is like. I don't know what desktop environment that you're going to like. It's the same with programming languages, IDEs. You have to try them. This is the only real correct answer to that question is you need to go out there and you need to try them. If you're tempted to ask that type of question on Reddit, I would highly recommend to you that you don't, because here's the problem I have with places like Reddit, Twitter, or X, excuse me, um, Mastodon, Discord, any of those places that you ask, you're going to get people answering those questions back to you. And there's no guarantee that the person that's going to answer your question isn't trolling you. I remember this was, might have been last week. I was looking at one of the subreddits out there on programming, and somebody asked about programming languages to get started on when you're more of a beginner. And this guy, I don't know if he's trolling or if he's being serious, but he was telling you that he was answering the question with, "Well, you really need to start out with assembly because I mean, really, it's the closest to the hardware. You really need to understand how the hardware is working. And he went on and on and on about the beauty parts of assembly. And I'm just sitting there rolling because I don't know if this guy is being serious. I mean, there are some people out there that do love to code in assembly, and I have no problem with that. If you like coding in assembly, go ahead. But to tell somebody who has not written a line of code in their life to start with assembly, that's a little bit of a stretch. So I don't know if this person was being a troll or what's going on. And I know it gets frustrating when we live in a world of choice. If you look at Linux distributions, there are a ton of them to choose from. If you go out there to Distro Watch, you're going to find that there is a whole slew of Linux distributions. Some of them are more geared towards the casual computer user. Some are more geared towards developers. And then some of them are geared towards people who really like torturing themselves and like Gen 2 Linux from scratch, maybe even Void Linux, where you have to do a lot of the work yourself. Then there's the beginner distributions. There's Linux Mint, there's Ubuntu, there's Pop OS. And there are some pretty advanced computer users who stick with just those because they like the simplicity. In other words, they want to use the computer more than they want to tinker with it. And I get that. I am the type of individual that I don't mind fixing the computer when it's broke, but to be perfectly honest, I would rather be using it to code, to surf the web, to do work, to do emails, to do this, that, than I would to sit there and tinker with the doggone thing all day because I actually do need to get something done. So, there's all kinds of answers. One resource that I found to be very helpful when it came to asking those type of generic questions was ChatGPT. I actually plugged into ChatGPT. What is a good Linux beginner distribution? And it spit out the usual list, at least the usual list for me, that I've seen a lot of beginner Linux distributions. These are not advanced. These were for beginners. I asked the same question about programming languages. What would be a good beginner programming language? And it spit out a pretty decent list. Same thing with IDEs. And I asked it, when it came to IDEs, I was asking it specific questions like, what's a good IDE for programming Python? What's a good IDE for programming C++? And I got a whole bunch of varying answers. All of these particular products that it recommended to me, I've heard of. I have used and installed them in the past. So ChatGPT, believe it or not, to me is a better resource to ask that question than to post that type of question on Reddit and get somebody trolling you, telling you, well, you should start with Gentoo Linux, or, oh yeah, if you really want to get into programming, you're going to have to do assembly because, you really need to get into the nitty gritty of the code. I'm like, why don't you just take the CPU apart and, try to program it manually on a breadboard? It just doesn't make any sense to me to tell people to start with some of the most god awful stuff. And that's because I can't tell if they're being a troll or if they're actually being serious. But there's no right answer to the question. You're just going to have to do the work to get there. And what that work involves is, let's say you want to start out with beginner Linux distributions. What I would do is either create some virtual machines of these distributions, or if you have another piece of hardware laying around, like an older laptop, put Linux distributions on that and play around there. And don't be afraid to take and you won't really destroy anything on your main computer, but you can use this side laptop to experiment with Linux distributions and then find the one that you happen to like the most. Once you do that, then you can start thinking about putting that on your main system. And the other thing, well, when it comes to programming languages, it's the same thing. You can install programming languages all over your main computer. IDEs. You can download a whole bunch of them, play around with the ones that you find, and then pick the one that you happen to like the most. The other thing is, don't be too worried if your choice happens to change as time goes on. When it came to Linux distributions, I was an Ubuntu user all the way back in like 2006. And I believe the first version of Ubuntu that I installed was Dapper Drake. Now, I actually go back further than that. I was using Red Hat 5.2 in college. This would have been in 1998. So I went from Red Hat, dropped Linux, went to Ubuntu, was using Ubuntu Dapper Drake. I went on to Linux Mint. I've gone on to Fedora. I used OpenSUSE for a while. Went back to, I think it was a regular Kubuntu, or maybe Ubuntu just with KDE installed. More recently, I was using Kubuntu, and now I'm actually on KDE Neon. So it's a journey. You may find that a Linux distribution that was serving your needs well for a long period of time suddenly doesn't, and maybe you need to go shop around again. The same thing has happened to me with IDEs. I was working with, when I first started doing Python, I use a lot of Eclipse-based tools. And so I was using Eclipse with PyDev, a plugin installed, and then I started doing some shopping around and I ran into PyCharm and I downloaded the community edition, which is free, worked with that for a while, and I really found that I liked it. In fact, I liked it a lot. It's my personal recommendation. If you're going to ask me what IDE are you using for your Python development, I'm going to say PyCharm, and I happen to really like PyCharm. Um, you may prefer Visual Studio Code, but the only thing is you're going to have to work to get there. You're going to have to do the experimentation to find out which one you happen to like the most. But my point, getting back to my point, was I changed my mind. I switched from using Eclipse based tools to using PyCharm. And I actually use PyCharm Professional because I happen to like the database tools that are built into it. I've also used CLion for their C and C++. And right now I actually have Rust, their Rust tool, Rustover, installed and been playing around with that. So I happen to like their tools. Now that doesn't mean that in a few short years, something else might come out and take its place. But for now, that's the one that I happen to like, and that's what I happen to enjoy using. So your mileage may vary. You may get onto Ubuntu, you find you like it, and you stick with it for long periods of time. But, you may find that, hey, OpenSUSE, you try it later on, and hey, I actually like this better. And that's what you land up going to. So you are allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to switch from whatever to whatever, and there shouldn't be any downside to doing that. You need to use what fits best for you. That's one of the best things about this type of ecosystem is when it comes to Linux and databases and programming languages, IDEs and video editors and blah, 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 you just pick one. We have a whole bunch of things to choose from. And that's because one size definitely does not fit all in this industry. So anyway, that's my rant and rave for today. So to recap, there's no answer to the question of what is the best. There is an answer to what is the best for you, but you're going to have to do the experimentation to find out what is the best for you. And if you are looking for answers on where to get started, what I would recommend is instead of posting those questions on Reddit, on X, on Mastodon, on any of those platforms, have a little conversation with ChatGPT and just say, hey, what is a good beginner blah, 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 and see what it spits out at you. Every time I asked those questions, I got at least 4 to 5 recommendations on where to begin. And that would be a good start. And then you don't run the risk of running into the almighty dreaded troll who's going to give you answers that are bizarre and unworldly. Okay? Well, that's all I had for today. So, other than that, Happy coding.